Hello everyone and welcome back to our channel. My name is Anda Malescu and I am the owner of Malescu Law, a law firm based in Miami, Florida, specializing in business, corporate and US immigration. We can assist you with all your immigration needs regardless of where you are currently located or where you plan to go in the United States. Today we are going to speak about the recent E-2 visa success story, and that is an E-2 visa approved for an investment in a US holding company. But before we get started, please subscribe to our channel by clicking the bell button or the subscribe button. In this case, the Canadian investor invested in a US business through a holding company, meaning that the investor invested in the holding company and thereafter invested through the holding company in a US subsidiary, which in this case was the operating company. The E-2 visa was approved for 5 years, which is the maximum allowed under the treaty between the United States and Canada, and the US Consulate in Toronto did not issue a request for further evidence, meaning that the investor was not asked to produce additional evidence before the case can be adjudicated. The total processing time for this E-2 visa was 2 months, and that is from the moment we submitted the application and until the application was adjudicated and approved at the interview. Now, this case involved a number of particularities and complexities because the investor, the Canadian investor, was in E-2 status in the United States for a number of years, which they obtained through a change of status and after through a change of employer. And also they have invested equipment in this case to be used by the US operating subsidiary, which conducts business in a specific sector of construction and junk removal. And based on its industry, it does require, for its general operation, the subsidiary requires that they possess a number of machineries and other equipment. The key takeaways for this approved E-2 visa with investments in a holding company are: 1. The holding company structure is viable for the E-2. This case shows that you can invest through a holding company in the United States and obtain an E-2 visa. And this structure of having a holding company owning subsidiaries also provides you with the flexibility to make further investments in the United States that could later qualify you for an immigrant visa, such as, for example, the EB-5 Immigrant Investor Program, through investments in your business. 2. Prior E-2 status. As I already mentioned, at the time we applied for the E-2 visa, the investor was already in the United States in E-2 status for about 3 years. So they initially came to the United States on B1 status, and then they invested in a prior E-2 business, in their original E-2 business, and they obtained an E-2 status through a change of status while in the United States. And only after about 2 years of being in E-2 status with that prior business, they actually considered transitioning to investments in a holding company. And that is primarily because they did not believe that the original business that they invested in can actually be successful, and they found another opportunity which indeed was more successful and decided to transition to that other investment. 3. Transition from prior E2 business to the holding company investment. As I already mentioned, the E2 investor was in the United States in E2 status based on an investment in a prior E2 business when they decided to invest in a new business through a holding company. Now, the holding company owns 50% of the operating subsidiary, and the operating subsidiary was already in existence with operations and employees at the time the investor transitioned from their prior E2 business to this investment in a holding company. So indirectly, through the holding company, the investor actually holds 50% interest in the US operating subsidiary. 4. Strategic use of existing assets. The investor's new business venture was in a similar industry as their initial E2 business, allowing for the transfer of the existing business machinery and equipment that were initially purchased for the first E2 business to be transferred to the holding company as a capital contribution, and thereafter used by the US subsidiary for the junk removal services. As a result, for the investment in the holding company, the investor did not contribute any cash and only contributed business equipment and machinery that were initially purchased for the first E2 business. 5. USCIS change of employer. When the investor invested in the junk removal business through the holding company, our firm simultaneously filed and obtained an approval from USCIS for a change of employer to the holding company and its operating subsidiary. So prior or simultaneously, if you will, to the investor starting to work with the holding company, we have obtained a USCIS approval for an E2 change of employer to the holding company. USCIS approved the change of employer for the maximum period allowed under the regulations, which is 2 years. And finally, 6, applying for E2 visa at the U.S. Consulate in Toronto. After the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services approved the change of employer for the investment in the holding company, the investor decided that it's in their best interest to obtain an E2 visa from the U.S. Consulate in Toronto in order to have the flexibility of traveling internationally. At the time, the investor only had an E2 status in the United States approved through the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, and they didn't have an E2 visa in their passport. This means that they were only in E2 status as long as they stayed in the United States. But if they wanted to leave the United States in order to travel outside of the United States for any reason, then in order to return to the United States, they would need an E2 visa, which means a new application will need to be sent to the U.S. Consulate in Toronto in order to be able to obtain that E2 visa. Now, with the E2 visa approved, the investor has 5 years validity in order to travel in and out of the United States. So they are not restricted to the 2 years in E2 status. Now, before ending this video, I want to give you an overview of the E2 visa. The E2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of treaty countries to come and live and work in the United States by making an investment in a U.S. business. In order to obtain an E2 visa, you can purchase a business, you can do a franchise, or you can start a business from scratch. Your spouse and your children, unmarried and under the age of 21, will also be able to obtain an E-2 visa. Also, with an E-2 visa, an investor can bring their executive managers or specialized employees that are essential to the US operation on an E-2 visa. If you want to learn more, you can always visit our website and check out our other videos on E-2 visa. This is all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to our channel, and if you need to get in touch with us, you have our contact information in this video and below this video. We will see you soon. Bye.